Thank you for thank you for coming. Is this working? Yeah. Yes. Thank you all for coming out tonight in July in America in 2018. There's a lot of other things to pay attention to right now, so I really appreciate you coming here to my very first book reading. Yeah. I know a lot of faces here, so I don't know how many people I need to sum up the book for, but for those of you who don't know the premise of the book, I wrote a memoir about my 40th year. I turned 40, really paralyzed with a certain amount of dread and shame and feeling like I had no sense of what was going to come, and everything I was seeing suggested it would be terrible and I might shrivel up overnight and there'd be nothing good to happen to me ever again. And of course that didn't turn out to be the case. And I spent that year, it was a more exhilarating year than I could have ever been prepared for, and a more difficult one in ways I wasn't prepared for. And I was resentful that no one had prepared me for any of those things, that we have such narrow stories about women. And so by the end of the year, I thought, I'm a writer. Perhaps I will write the story that I am missing, and subsequently, we have this book. So I'm just going to read a little short, 2 short passages, and then Amina and I are going to talk, and then we'll have some questions. All right. 8 hours before my 40th birthday, I sat alone at my desk on the 17th floor of an office building in downtown Manhattan, unable to shake the conviction that midnight was hanging over me like a guillotine. I was certain that come the stroke of 12, my life would be cleaved in two, a before and an after. All that was good and interesting about me, that made me a person worthy of attention, considered by the world to be full of potential, would be stripped away, and whatever remained would be thrust, unrecognizable, into the void that awaited. It was ridiculous. Deep down, I knew it was ridiculous. However, knowing this did not keep me from anxiously glancing at the clock out in the hallway, as if the hands on it were actual blades. I thought of my mother, of course. Whether or not we actually resemble the image we see, our mothers are our first and most lasting reflection of ourselves, a mirror we gaze into from birth until death. I was 8 when my mother turned 40 and sensed an abandon all hope, ye who enter here message woven into the colorful birthday cards that arrived in the mail for her. As if simply by turning 40, my mother had somehow failed at something. And now here I was, so many years later, about to turn 40 myself, gripped by those identical fears, despite all my determination to be otherwise. 8-year-old me would have been revolted. I pulled out my phone, automatically angled my head in a well-practiced tilt, and took a selfie. Somewhat of a theme. I was aware that to the outside world, I could not have appeared less like a woman who should be worried about her age, less like someone who is now spending the last hours before her birthday seized by the belief she was being marched to her demise. In all likelihood, even my friends would have been surprised to hear it. I was not known as a person who tended to cower. I was a person who kept going, who took care of things, who always had the answer, who rarely asked for help. I knew what I wanted and what I liked, which was probably why most of my friends had taken me at my word when I said I didn't want a birthday party. I'd spent much of the year being the good daughter, the good sister, the good friend. My mother had been diagnosed with Parkinson's not that long ago, and the speed of its progression had left us breathless. My sister was home alone with 2 small children and a third on the way. I'd been the emergency contact for more than a few of my friends whose marriages were imploding, who'd suffered family tragedies. Far from spending the summer panicking about my age, I'd instead occasionally wondered whether the world was conspiring to do me a very cruel favor. It sometimes felt as though many of the things a single childless woman on the eve of her 40s is supposed to be most fearful of never having attained, the right guy, the happy marriage, the babies, the not dying alone, had been lined up for my inspection, and then, one by one, unveiled to relieve the worst-case scenario. It wasn't that I was missing out on happy endings. There were no happy endings. Still, it was a truth universally acknowledged, gleaned from stacks of literature, countless movies, and decades of magazine purchases I'd made, that by age 40, I was supposed to have a certain kind of life. One that, whatever else it might involve, included a partner and babies. Having acquired neither of these, it was nearly impossible, no matter how smart, educated, or lucky I was, not to conclude that I had officially become the wrong answer to the question of what made a woman's life worth living. If this story wasn't going to end with marriage or a child, what then? Could it even be called a story? And then Thank you. I'm going to jump ahead in the book a little bit to later in the year. A very good friend of mine who features in the book, Jo, was the deputy editor of a travel website, and she sent me to write a story about cruising through the south of France. So I'm taking us out of America for a little bit, you guys. Thank you. Yeah. You're welcome. I was once again catapulted out of my life and across the ocean. And within hours of exiting the plane in Marseille, I found myself on the balcony of my gilded stateroom, overlooking the flowing Rhone River. When I leaned out the window to take a selfie against the scenery, again, it looked like I'd photoshopped myself into a Van Gogh painting. Everything was decadent, from the light to the trees lining the water's edge, to the cheese that oozed out on the china plates in the dining room. Before coming on this trip, I'd make jokes about the senior citizens cruise I was embarking on. As it turned out, I was the youngest on board by about 20 years. But sitting here, rolling French vineyards visible through the windows, I was deeply struck by how these privileged men and women had seemingly excelled at later life. This was the lifestyle we were all encouraged to save up for, the reward. With my mother, I had seen the worst-case version of what we imagined growing old to be. Here I was observing the best case. The difference was striking, especially coming back to back. In the mornings, I watched as women served portions of soft-boiled eggs and buttered toast to their husbands, while both sat in habitual silence. Perhaps that's what marriage eventually became, one long ritual of performed habits. Over dinner one night, I was invited to join a table of two couples. My solitariness stood out nearly as much as my age in this group, and since arriving, I'd been on the receiving end of many curious stares, as if my being alone made them uncomfortable. I picked up my plate and plunked down in the chair they'd pulled up for me. It soon became clear they didn't know each other either, and as the first course arrived, dinner was at least 4 courses, they began well-owned introductory stories about themselves. The couple on my left had met as children in Afghanistan more than 40 years ago. They'd had a clandestine relationship that continued into their teens. Afterwards, they managed to stay in touch when he was temporarily jailed during college for participating in protests. He wrote me notes on toilet paper, the wife said, placing her hand over his and smiling at me, and then stuffed them into his pockets where his mother would retrieve them when she came to pick up his laundry. After her family immigrated to Germany in the late 70s, they lost touch. A few years later, shortly after he was released from jail, he traveled to visit family in Germany. The very first person he ran into at the airport was her cousin. Inquiring after her whereabouts, he quickly traveled to meet her. 2 years later, they were married and immigrated to California. 30 years and still we go strong, the husband said, smiling proudly. The couple on the other side of me were 2 women, Judy and Joan, celebrating their 6th wedding anniversary and their 65th birthdays. At first glance, I'd pegged them for a pair that had been together for decades, but I couldn't have been more wrong. We met on Match.com, Judy told me. Judy reminded me of B. Arthur, tall and stooping, with a deep, commanding voice that suggested she was not in the habit of suffering the opinions of others. My husband had died in a fire a few years before. Her breath caught with emotion. And the second I met her, I knew Joan was the one. Joan looked like an older, heavier, taller version of Blanche Devereaux. I'd seen her being helped on board earlier, navigating the walkway with 2 canes. Same for me, said Joan. I'd been divorced for 5 years, but I knew. My husband walked me down the aisle. So much for thinking I had these people or anything else pegged. I could practically hear Katharine Hepburn's sharp voice ring out from the Philadelphia story. The time to make up your mind about people is never. Here, I thought, were the stories that made marriage seem like a good idea, something to be pursued and something that could be sustained. Advertisements for marriage. Eventually, talk turned to me, and I explained I was on board to write a story for a travel site. Do you ever come to California? Asked the man. I'd like you to meet my son. He is very smart and very handsome, but he needs to meet a good woman. I laughed. I'm sure he's too young for me, I said. The man shook his head emphatically. Oh no, he's 28. I paused, but only briefly. I was learning to get a kick out of the response some people had to my actual age. I'm 40, I said, and waited. The round of gasp and raised eyebrows I'd anticipated did not disappoint. After demanding I reveal what year I'd been born in, the man leaned back in his chair and looked at me with raised eyebrows. "And you are not married?" "I'm not," I said, only realizing afterward the question had been entirely drained of its sting. Then again, perhaps it's hard to be stung when you have just stuffed yourself with a pound of stinky, gooey cheese and followed it up with a bowl of chocolate mousse. His wife leaned forward. She'd been pleasant and smiling throughout the meal, but now sounded a bit alarmed. "Oh, but I hope you're not ruling marriage out entirely." I looked around at all the wealth and security and pleasantness, and then back at this couple who had survived so much, and to the two women who'd found each other so late in life, and wondered at the idea that anyone could rule out anything other than death. I assured her I wasn't ruling anything out, and then grinned. But at this point, it would take a lot of convincing. One of the reasons I was on this boat, after all, was because I never had to check in with anyone when I wanted to do something.
These chairs are so comfortable. Is this on? Yes?
Okay.
Yes? Perfect. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Glynnis, let's get the most important question out of the way. What lipstick are you wearing on the cover of your book?
I actually can't. It's either NARS Jungle Red.
Okay.
Or it's Chanel Gabriel, and I don't remember which.
Okay.
Those are the two that are in my bag.
This
always.
is literally why I came to this book talk, so I'm done
Thanks for coming
here.
out, everyone.
How are you feeling?
I was really good until about 10 minutes ago, and then I got completely overwhelmed coming out here. But good, it's a little strange to see my face everywhere, I have to say. And it's a little strange to realize all the people who are buying this book know a lot of personal details of my life, but.
Is that something that, I feel like I have this question for everybody who writes a memoir, and I already know the answer, is when you go into writing a memoir, and especially something that is so intimate and real, how do you psych yourself up, and what are all the things you thought that you already knew that are surprising you now that the book is out?
Oh, that's interesting. When I went into it, I was really so, like, as a voracious reader and somebody who really depended on stories growing up, I was just in a state of like resentment that there was no good stories about women. We have such narrow narratives around female experience. And I just thought I couldn't think of a single story about a woman that didn't end in a wedding or with a baby. And that frustrated me increasingly to the point where I just thought I became energized to write my own. The actual writing of it, the first draft, because I was writing with something that had happened to me so recently, I didn't have as much perspective as I might have had I been writing the memoir of Glynnis, age 23. And I think that I had to write through it a lot. I have my editor, Christine, who is here, is extremely patient. And when I gave her my first draft, I said, "I think this is very messy." And she just goes, "Well, it's not the worst first draft I've ever seen." Which was so good to hear, because I was like, "Oh, I can trust you. You're not telling me. You're not telling me what I want to hear." Anyway, what did I learn? There's this weird experience where I have a hard time remembering the details of that year now, because it's all in a book. Like, I've exercised it from myself to the point that it's like I've cut it out of my head almost, which is a great argument for therapy and journaling, I have to say. I've just taken it to a really extreme level. And I think the interesting thing is I'm 43 now, and I don't feel this anxiety anymore. So some people who've read the book respond to me as if I'm experiencing everything I'm writing about in it right now, and I'm not. I'm experiencing anxiety and dread about a whole bunch of other things right now that have nothing to do with me. So that, I think I got distance from it just from publishing it. These things, I'm glad that I wrote it in the moment, because I worry, it was very real, and I think it's very real for a lot of women. And I now realize, had I waited the 10 years to get the perspective, it would have done a disservice to how intense that period of time was.
The thing that I was really surprised by reading the book, because obviously I know you, was that I had never clocked the feelings of, like the insecurity, the not being sure about things. Because in our world, Glynnis is the number one phone call that you make. She's the most reliable person. 3 a.m., you're in jail, you call Glynnis. Yeah. Need your kids picked up, you call Glynnis. And, and I think, and so much of that was striking to me because you've come to be this very reliable constant in people's lives. And yet the story that we tell about, like older single women is that they're a mess.
Yeah.
And that's so not true for you.
Thank you. That's good to hear. I think that's not true for many women. I think one of the things I knew my experience would be relatable because I was looking to my left and my right and seeing a whole bunch of women who are experiencing the same things as me and then not seeing anyone talk about it. But I also think sometimes it is easier to fix other people's lives than your own. But I also think when you're a woman living alone in a world that's really not set up for solitary women in any way whatsoever, money-wise, infrastructure, jobs, living situation, it's hard. You have to learn like a survival skill in many ways, an emotional survival skill, it's a lot. You don't have someone to come home to. And I think somebody tweeted at me and said, "Oh, it's so nice you have a dishwasher," which I was like, that was my old apartment. But I used to say, it would be nice if I came home and somebody had already loaded the dishwasher. Now I just come home and be like, somebody could have done the 17 dishes that are sitting in my sink. But little stuff like that wears you down. So I think this idea that women are a mess, I think that's a convenient story we tell because we like to look at women as a problem in need of a solution. And that's, in my experience in real life, rarely the case.
You are not a mess. As your messy friend, I can confirm that. I'm the mess in the friend group. Going down that route though, I think that it's so strange. You're right that it's 2018 and I can't name more than 2 or 3 books that talk about women who have chosen to live alone and talk about their adventures and the exciting lives that they lead, and there's not a waiting for what's the next step, And so I was wondering if you can talk about the ways that we're so conditioned to think about the baby and the husband really as adulthood markers, and and the thing is that the economics and the demographics that we live in now just do not bear that out. People are getting married later. It doesn't mean that you're not an adult till you're 33 or whatever.
Or as the case of what I just read, 65. The anecdote I always pull out to begin this is that it was illegal for women to have their own credit cards until 1974, which is also the year I was born. And I think what we're experiencing now, and the reason the numbers don't reflect it, is that women have a financial independence that allows them to live the life as they want it and not... my theory is everyone's second marriage is going to be to a woman because no one has to marry a man for financial security anymore. I haven't coined the term for that quite yet, but I really think that's what's going to happen.
It's definitely what's happening with all my college friends.
It is. I'm not kidding. I'm not making that up. I see it keep happening, and I'm like, yeah. I mean, but. I think, when we talk about rituals around women's lives, I think it really helps to ask the question, who benefits from these rituals? Who benefits from the idea we're supposed to be married and have children? You can just look at the headlines today. It's rarely women, and in the past, it's never been women. And, I think the stories we tell to women about how to value their lives, a lot of women have been gaslit into thinking these are the only 2 things. But that's... it was the only route to any security for a lot of women. So, it was sort of the glaze on the story. We to sugar it up. I think what I find very difficult, and we've talked about this before, is the lack of ritual around your life if you don't have a wedding and you don't have a baby. There is very few ways to mark the progression of your life. Rituals are important. Like they're so important. And after, like, that Sex and the City episode that always gets mocked where Carrie, seeing a lot of people nod because we all know what I'm going to say.
Not me. I never watched Sex and the City. Tell me.
The man with Sex and the City came back to, and it was because it always got there first. Rebecca Tracer once said Sex and the City got to everything first, and it's a lot of truth to that. Where Carrie has everyone buy her shoes because she's been to everyone's bridal shower and baby shower, a woman's right to shoes. But there's a real truth to that, which is how are you recognized in your life?
You
as
write
a
book,
woman.
Glynnis. You write a book.
Yeah, what happens
we'll
if you're...
throw you many parties.
What happens if you're not a writer? Like, just this sense I think a lot of women struggle with, too, because it's this, like, invisibility factor as you age is true for all women. I mean, that's a larger conversation, but I think it can be difficult. So I think what we're going to see is women creating rituals around their lives. And you're seeing that already. And it's the backlash against the self-care conversation is, I think, pretty telling of how we're really struggling to figure out how to recognize ourselves. And that's, going a bunch of different routes right now as we sort it out.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm glad that you brought that up because I think that, the thing about not being married and not having a kid means that you have more time and usually means
money.
that you have more money, you have more time to kill it at work. And not to say, I usually hate how this conversation is always pitted against, like, here are your married friends, here are your, married with children, and then here are your single friends. It's there are varying degrees of how these stories get told and how people's agency gets validated. But in general, for single women, our contributions to society are they're not discussed. It's when you think about Rebecca Traster's work or Eric Kleinenberg's work, where he talks about single living and the way that single people revitalize cities. That is so true in the book that you wrote. Like, you are quintessential New Yorker.
Yeah. Yes. Somebody, I wrote a piece for the Times this weekend that a lot of people read, and I've been getting strange emails from. Thank you.
Can you summarize the piece for those who haven't read it?
I wrote a article about how no one believes I'm happy. What got cut from that article was the paragraph where I said, all of my friends do that. And like, even when I was encountering, like, are you ruling marriage out entirely? I encounter a lot of, like, oh, don't worry, there's still time, or don't worry, you'll find somebody, or, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. There was you're gonna call a sperm doctor in 8 years and have them delivering to you when you panic. Just this, like, deep sense of, I don't believe you, know yourself, which is what really frustrates. Those conversations, I don't usually get offended by them, but from time to time I'm like, what is it about my life that suggests I don't know what I want?
But don't you think that conversation a lot of times is more revealing about the person that is having it with you?
Absolutely. But it does get a little exhausting because you run the risk of sounding defensive in a way that's a little bit, the lady doth protest too much, which, by the way, when I used that line in the thing, I was like, no one ever says the men doth protest too much. Men protest all the time, and no one suggests they don't know what they're saying. It's true. Anyway, that was the premise of the piece. And a lot of the responses I got were from women thanking me for recognizing the value in their lives. And I just thought that was so telling in how women's lives, and I include my married friends with children in this too, a lot of times women's lives, regardless of what they've done, and we see that in the Times obits, again and again, are not recognized outside their role as mother or wife. And I would just love for us to figure out how to have a conversation about women's experience that mentions neither the husband nor the child. Just as an exercise, just like a fun exercise.
We'll get you an opinion column at the time.
Right.
You can figure it out. I mean, it's true, though, how those experiences always get flattened. And the thing that stands out is she was a great mom, or she was the wife of this very important person. And we still do not have permission to talk about our accomplishments outside of that realm. And a lot of what happens is conflict, you know? And so I found it particularly interesting how you navigated that conflict with the people in your life, because you know, you are reliable. You're reliable Auntie Glynnis. You're a reliable friend. You are a reliable coworker. But there is an undercurrent of tension that happens because you don't have, you know, seemingly do not have the same responsibilities as a lot of these people.
I think there's a period of time, and I don't even include my closest friends in this, but there was a general sense that, like, for women who aren't married, there's like a space beside you, and people think that they have access, that you walk around with, like, I almost think of it as like, there's this empty space here and people think it's my free time that they have access to, and that it's just that I have nothing else to do. That, like, clearly...
Right, you have nothing else going on.
I have nothing else happening, and so clearly all of this free time that I have is at their disposal, and there's no recognition of the things that might be overwhelming in my life or in the life of many people. In the book, my mother was very ill, and I was functioning as a caretaker a lot of the time, and my sister was a single parent of 3 children, and I was functioning as a caretaker a lot of the time. But there was this sort of sense that I had an abundancy of free time, and that almost like when women are pregnant and like strangers can come up and touch your stomach, it's a little bit like this assumption of my free time was there for the taking. And I found that really hard, both because I think women have a hard time. We're not trained to say no to helping. We're trained to to be helpful a lot of the time. But also because I wanted to be helpful, and it was really hard for me to say, like, this is now too much. I am overwhelmed and drowning a little bit. And then the third thing there goes back to, you know, person who can load the dishwasher. Like, in addition to that, then you have to ask for help, which is also we've talked about this a lot, but when you live by yourself and are used to doing everything on your own, you are so not conditioned to ask for help at all. And so that's a real challenge, I think. I got over it eventually. I had to. That's the thing, because it's stressful in your friendships, and also people want to be helpful. Like, it's not like I said to anybody I need help and they're like, oh, you're so selfish. Like, you have all this free time. It's like, no, of course they want to help. But it's like, those are steps you have to go through, and it's tough. It's hard.
I'm glad that you used the word selfish, because it's the number one accusation that gets lobbed at you when you are not a willing participant in other people's, the choices that they have made for their lives. And you talk a lot about ambition also, and being an ambitious person and not apologizing for it. And I don't know, I was like, these are the conversations that we have in our text messages. I'm like, are other people having these conversations out loud? Because it is, you know, it's like saying those words is scary.
Yeah, it is. It is scary. We don't have a language around this yet that is acceptable. I didn't get a lot of emails from men from the Times piece, but I did get some, and all of them, not all of them, some of them are quite nice. A lot of 65-year-old bachelors in Europe wanted me to know they were also happy. I was like, of course you're happy, you're in Europe and you have health care. But I did, the selfish is the thing that came up. I got, all I see when I read your article is how selfish you are, and and your job is to sacrifice. And I'm like, somebody was like, go read Jordan Peterson. And I was like, yeah.
Like, I already know how to do my own laundry.
Right.
Thank you.
But I think, and part of this too is that this isn't me. None of us are conditioned to be, like, look at the last election. We're not conditioned to be ambitious women. We're not rewarded for ambition outside of certain prescribed roles. And that's exhausting after a while. It just makes you not want to put yourself out there as a mark, I think, sometimes. Again, though, living in New York sets that off. I've had friends for a really long time. It's not like I do have friends who hear these things from, like, their college circle friends, and like I don't get that from my friends. None of my friends have ever said to me, like, are you sure? Like, don't worry, there's still time. Like, I would be like, are you on drugs?
No,
right
we're
now?
too busy enjoying the benefits of how you help us.
Exactly. Don't worry, there's still time. Thank you for holding my child. So I think it's just more culturally. And it goes again back to like, on my 40th birthday, what I wanted to do is like go to the movies and see some movie that felt like it aligned with my experience, and there's just nothing. It was nothing.
No, there's nothing. There's no rom-com.
No.
There's not even a horror movie.
The
That's
best
like, here's what happens to the 40-year-old single lady.
I think this book is a horror movie to a lot of men that are currently have a lot of power. I do think the fact that we keep hearing the phrase "lock her up" at political rallies is pretty telling of the horror certain men in this country are feeling over the ability of women to determine their own lives. I mean, this is not news.
Do you want to just talk about the news? We can do that too. Can you talk a little bit more about your travels that year? Because I feel like you got some fun, sexy travel out of your fun parts out of your middle age anxiety, angst that you were feeling.
It was just timing. My friend Jo was the editor of a travel site, and she kept sending me on these trips, so I was able to take these trips. And because I'd like finally reached a level of stability in my writing career, I could leave, and then I could leave. And also I felt there was this weird moment. It really happened overnight. I woke up on my 40th birthday, and I suddenly felt completely untethered from the clock, or like the expectations around these are the things you have to have. It just disappeared. And so when I ventured out into the world, it was with like that conversation that I read earlier. 5 years before that, or 3 years before that, it probably would have made me feel terrible. Like it would have been, I would have dreaded walking into that dining room and having to say like, I'm here by myself. Yeah. Whereas by the time I got there, I was having such a good time. It amused me more than anything. And the same as, at the end of the book, Jo and I do a cross-country road trip, and then I end up going back to Wyoming for a month and living with like a bunch of cowboys on a dude ranch, which was really fun. But like just that freedom, I literally could just take off when I wanted. And because emotionally I felt unencumbered by expectations around my life, it allowed those trips to be enjoyable in ways that they wouldn't have a year or so before. There were some good trips in there.
There were some good trips. Can you talk also about going back to Wyoming specifically? Because I think that you paint such a picture of feeling so free and just feeling like you can do it. You can go back somewhere for weeks on end and love being there.
Wyoming is the exact opposite of New York City. It's the emptiest place in the country. It's the emptiest place. It's literally, you can drive for like 2 hours and not see anybody. It was so mesmerizing to me to be in such a wide open space, and there was no internet. I mean, not not intentionally. There's terrible internet connection there, so you would not have any internet. And I was staying at this ranch in the Bighorn Mountains where I could hike out into the wilderness for hours at a time. And the year had been difficult in many ways, and so just this. And I had signed a book deal for, I think they mentioned the period book earlier. So I had blocked out a month to write, and I just thought, I don't have to be in New York. I can go back to this place that was so mesmerizing and soothing to me. And after a year that had been quite difficult with my mother's illness, I felt just like very simply happy to be there. It was really, and just like away from the internet and away from all of the, relentless sort of voices that we hear. And so I really fell in love with it when we stopped there. And just on a whim, I just thought, what's the worst that can happen? They're going to say no. I emailed them and said, can I come back, and in exchange for room and board, I'll do these things for you. And they were like, sure. And I just thought, well, great. I'll just do it. That's a really, I don't know that I could do that now, but like I was in that moment, it was possible. And it was just fun to be able to it was a real exercise of the freedom that I talk about, to literally just take off like that. Like I didn't have to, I could just go.
Yeah, I mean, I love your writing around that too, because it's such a reminder that one of the great privileges of, long-term single childless life is that you can still be spontaneous.
Yes.
And a lot of times it does take you that long to build up the courage to have those kinds of adventures. And,
I had to convince I was like, I can go. Like I had to convince myself that this was a possibility, because I kept thinking like, oh, I shouldn't do this. Like this, I should have responsibilities here. I think there's a sense to, like, a shame factor around there's a shame factor around freedom for women, because if you are free, you don't have the things you're supposed to have. And so there was this like small part of me that just thought, oh, should I be apologetic about the fact I can just leave and go and not come back for weeks and I don't have to tell anybody? I mean, I did tell people that I did it, but like, and it was the weird thing because I just thought, well, this is an amazing thing. Why should I feel bad about it? But it's really, we really train women to feel bad about having a lot of freedom.
Yeah, no, we feel bad about that's why we say sorry all the time. Yeah. Sorry for the things you're not sorry about. Sorry when you are sorry. Mm-hmm. You know, you're about to go on a major book tour because the book is major. And I know that you're going to meet all sorts of women and have a lot projected onto you and have, there's going to be an endless debate about this. What were you trying to impart, and what do you hope that the reader takes away from your own story?
I wanted to offer a different idea of what a fulfilling life for a woman looks like. I want people to understand there are different ways to live and feel good about it, and just to be able to look out there and say there's a different path I can take. It's going to be okay. But mostly that my life is as fulfilling and complicated, difficult and joyous. The amount of people that you couldn't possibly experience joy. I got a lot of emails like that this weekend.
You're like, have you been alone at 2:00 in the morning with ice cream? Like, this is my happiest place.
And like just see the lives of women as complicated and wonderful and joyous as they are. And what I was really trying to do with this book was that I felt that I'd gone sort of out into this uncharted place. There's no sort of blueprint for how to live alone as a woman, not an established one. And I just wanted to send back a dispatch and be like, hey, it's kind of great out here. Here's why it's scary and here's why it's wonderful. It's not at all what I expected. And just like do a report back from the land of being 40.
Thank you for going before me and telling me all about it.
But that's the thing too, is like I'm here. There's so many. I'm not new. There's nothing new about my experience. The only new thing is that I got convinced somebody to pay me to write about it, like, and that it's and people are reading it. Like, there's this. This isn't a new experience for women. It's somewhat new because we have financial security that we didn't. But like, a lot of people live like this, and we just are not recognizing it as a valid way. So I really just want to say, like, this is a valid way to exist. And it's great.
Questions? Yeah. We're going to take a couple of questions now. There's going to be a microphone roving around the audience, so if you have a question, let us know.
Raise your hand. I will do my best to bring you.
We'll answer, please have a question, not a statement. And if you want to talk about politics and who's going to jail, we can talk about that later. Questions? Yeah.
Thanks so much for the book. I'm really looking forward to reading it. Just bought it. I'm actually making a film. I'm a documentary maker. I'm making a film about living child-free. And I just wondered why you use the term, if it's deliberate to use the term childless, not child-free.
The Times asked me this too for the piece. I have no thoughts on that. I'm not offended by either. And the funny thing was, I got an edit note saying, do you prefer childless or child-free? And I was like, I honestly could care less. I know some women are bothered by the term childless as if they're less than, but the term child-free, I happened to be responding to that email with 2 nephews and my niece on my lap. And I was like, I'm never free of children either. I tend to say, I don't have children, but I do think that, again, the conversation around this is really a conversation around the language around women's lives that we're still sorting out. So if people have preferences, then I'm happy to respect them. I don't. So you can call me a spinster if you want, or an old maid. I don't really. All good.
A bold maid.
A bold maid.
First of all, I love the book. Thank you so much for writing it, Glynnis.
Thank you.
My question that I was sort of asking myself while I was reading it and that I'm dying to know is, have any of the men in the book read the book, and what do they think about it?
I don't know. I imagine I might find out at some point. I don't know the answer to that. The men who are in the book who kept their real names have read it and they gave the okay, but I changed everyone else's. So I don't know. My guess is that I might be on the receiving end of a few emails at some point, but I don't really care, to be honest. Like, I kind of am like, I'll let you know, though, to be continued.
Hey, I'm here because I listened to the podcast. I've actually never listened to the podcast, so what a gift. Like,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Call Your Girlfriend podcast.
Thank you so much.
The OG.
But yeah, your article was going viral, and I somehow found myself, it was super cool. I was really struck by your mention of Sandra Bland and your awareness of being a white woman.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just unpack fear for me? Because I think a lot about
Can I unpack? I didn't hear you.
fear.
Fear.
I mean, you are fabulous, and I know you no longer have fear. But I'm thinking
I do have fear. When my health bill comes in every month,
that's real.
I definitely.
That's real. I guess I'm just thinking about as somebody who does solo traveling.
Yes.
The moment where I am reminded I'm not a white woman.
Yeah.
So.
I never have that experience. I'm very aware of that. I will say, so part of this book is I drive across the country. I've driven across the country many, many times over the years. The first time was the year after September 11th. It was a much different country to drive across, and also it was before the iPhone, which has made a huge difference to women traveling by themselves, because before that you were traveling literally with one of the old atlas maps in the but I'm also Canadian, by the way. Some CanCon in the audience. I think because I go through customs on a regular basis, traveling back and forth to visit my family, and because I bring the awareness, Canadians have a weird sort of close third person relationship to the States. We grow up on American TV and travel there all the time, so there's this weird understanding. We almost understand America better than it understands itself sometimes because you're outside of it. That I was always aware driving across the country, and I talk about it a little bit in the book, how differently, that technically I am an immigrant, and how differently I've always been treated by, there's a part in the book where we get stopped at a border check, and I was in a car with 3 Israelis, and I was the person in the car that was not American, and they didn't care about me because the Israelis had darker colored skin. And you mentioned Sandra Bland. Sandra Bland, I left on the road trip, the most recent one, I think 3 days after she died, and she was on the news, and because I'm so obsessed with road trips, and Thelma and Louise was a favorite movie, and Little House on the Prairie were my favorite books growing up, I'm always aware of how differently women travel across the country, and in addition to that, in this country, how different white people travel across the country. And that if I'm talking about the narrative around the lack of women on the road, or the lack of narratives around single women's experience, the narrative around people of color on the road in this country is almost always a slave narrative, right? We don't have an updated version of it. And the lack of stories we tell about people's lives, in my case, was suffocating to me, wasn't deadly. And that's a very big difference when you talk about fear. The lack of how we tell stories about people's experience in this country is often very deadly. Not for me, though. But I'm aware of that at all times. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Someone asked me if I had one piece of advice or if this book was not prescriptive, but if I had one piece of advice to give to people, my piece of advice is always you should drive across the United States. It's a much different country to experience when you're on the road than from here or from any one place. I think it's always amazing to me that it's one country.
Thank you so much. This question isn't going to be as eloquent as I want it to be, but I've been thinking a lot about, obviously, the last week and the recent SCOTUS announcement. And for women who are choosing not to have children, what the future of healthcare in this country is going to mean for women who, 1, are choosing not to have children, or 2, who don't have the choice to not have children. And so wondering if you could maybe share some thoughts around that. I'm,
as I said, Canadian, and I grew up with universal health care. My family still lives in Canada, as do many of my friends who have children. And when I try and explain to them what we pay for down here, they sometimes don't believe me. And I've done interviews now with some Canadian media around this book. And one of them was happening when Anthony Kennedy resigned, and I started yelling, and then she didn't understand why I was so upset. Like, it's very difficult. I don't know what the answer is. There seems to be two things happening right now. We're getting, like, the pushback against women's rights is obviously overwhelming, but at the same time, we're hearing women are making more of their own decisions. So there's like this dueling narrative of we're having women have more power over their lives at the same time that these things are obviously connected. I think as women choose to have less children, this might be the thing that forces the conversation to change as the population drops around how we regard maternal health care in this country. Like, what's the play, Lysistrata, where they all refuse to have sex until something changes? Like, it's sort of like the fertility Lysistrata. Like, but I don't know. I just got the notice of how much my healthcare is going to be next year, and I thought there was an extra zero that shouldn't have been there. Like, I don't know the answer. It's overwhelming. I'm sorry, I have no wisdom on healthcare in the United States. I think there's a protest at Union Square tonight for the SCOTUS. So we can all go over together. Oh, it just happened. Okay. I'm sure there'll be more. Anyone else?
Can you repeat the question?
What sort of positive ritual would I like to see as a single woman? I don't actually know the answer to that, and I really have put thought into this. I don't know. I'd be so curious to hear what other people think. Like, how do we?
I have so many feelings
okay,
about
hit me.
Are
'Cause
you
I don't know.
serious?
Yeah, no, go.
I want some sort of like financial starter pack.
Okay.
For, it's like money for like, oh, you're 30 and you live alone and you have a good job and you're not breaking anything. Here is a lot of money for you.
Yes.
But I think truly like the conversation around the rituals too is that part of my annoyance around rituals around women adulthood lives is that we frame things as accomplishments that are not really. Like, marriage is beautiful. It is not an accomplishment. Children are beautiful. I love them. I love all of the kids in my life. Having them is not an accomplishment. And at the same time, we don't celebrate professional accomplishments that we have all of the time. And so I think that reframing how we have those celebrations or how we announce those things is probably a larger part of the conversation than that.
Reframing
but also,
the whole thing instead of
we should give 30-year-old like single women a lot of money and just be like, good
I'm
job.
into that.
And do it at every decade of your life. Like, you should just have a party that's like, welcome to this decade. You're
You
doing
get a
it
bonus.
alone.
You get an age bonus. Listen, that's what I want.
I always want money, so
Yeah,
that's
no,
it.
well, it should always be money. And maybe like one red lipstick, but okay. Here's your starter pack and a red lipstick. I think probably what's happening is, I was talking to somebody the other day, like, I live on the top floor of a house owned by my oldest friend in New York and her husband, and which is an ideal situation, but I'm not the only woman I know living like that. And I have started to wonder whether I'm modeling a living situation that we're going to see as more common going forward. You can make the joke of the maiden aunt in the attic, but like, it's fine. I get
Your
fed a lot.
attic is fabulous.
Yeah. But I do think that as people have children later, as family structures is not there to support with childcare, like, you're going to be seeing more setups like this just naturally happen. And I just, being sort of on the front lines of this, living this, I don't necessarily have examples to look to, but I look sort of side to side and see a lot of people experiencing similar things to me. And I wonder if this is, going to be a very common thing going forward.
We have time for one or two more. Anybody's got one?
This isn't really about the book. Oh, I'm good. It's fine.
projecting.
I haven't gotten to read the book yet, but thank you Glynnis, for writing it.
Oh,
Very
thank you.
excited to read it now that I have it. This is just kind of future thinking and positive. What's the next, especially as, what's the next big trip or exciting thing that you have coming up that maybe you can talk about with us?
Oh, well, I'm doing a book tour, so yeah, which is great. And actually, Joe, who's in the book, has a novel coming out called Charlotte Walsh Likes to Win, and we're going through a book tour of the Midwest, which I'm excited about because I feel like in a lot of things, the Midwest doesn't get the attention that it should. And I like the Midwest. And then at the end of August, I'm going to Paris. So I would say that Paris is aging women in Paris just know how to do it right. They really, I sometimes go there, just wander around and look. They're living very full lives with universal health care. But yeah, they're really fabulous in ways that I think was so noticeable to me the first summer I went to Paris. Not ever, but I spent time there when I guess it was the summer I was 41 maybe, and I just remember looking around and being like, here are the examples I've been missing, just everywhere around me. Yeah, the French have really nailed older women. No pun intended. Although.
Time's up, Glynnis. No.
Time's up.
I think one more, and then we're out of here.
Here.
There's some hands.
Here we go.
Well, my question is not that serious, but
That's good.
but I'm in my 20s and I've traveled a lot and I live alone and stuff like that, and I've noticed that I encounter a lot of creeps, you know, there's no opportunity to just meet someone and be friends with them. There's it's very sexualized. So does it get better as you get older? Do you meet
I will just tell you, spoiler alert, I'm bad at dating, as you will discover in the first chapters of this book. I think it gets better. Everything gets better the more secure you are in yourself. You know, does that the more secure you become, which is only something that happens as you get older. The more secure you are in who you are, the easier that stuff gets. You tend to, at this point, I have no dating. I just you put up with so much less nonsense. It's just so much less interesting, and you are gripped, I think, by less second guessing of yourself. So in that, everything gets better as you get older, I would say. I can't offer you the most encouraging words about the dating scene, but a lot of my friends here who have wonderful husbands, very supportive of my book, and so they've found nice people. Yes, last question.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
What do you love about writing this book, and what was the most difficult part about writing this book?
Whew. I loved.
Can you repeat the question?
What did I love about writing in this book, and what was the most difficult part? I loved, especially as a writer coming from the internet, having so many quick deadlines. I loved being able to focus on a big project and really remove myself from the world and just go into my own place to write. That was hard to do at first, and then I got so used to it, and then I really enjoyed it so much that coming back to the world was oof, it was kind of rough. The most difficult thing was my mom died 3 weeks after I handed the first draft in, and so it necessitated a lot of revisions in the revision process that were emotionally fraught. It was a tough revision. So yeah, that was tough. But yeah, I'm glad it's done.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone.
Thank you, Amina, everyone.
Glynnis. Thank you for writing the blueprint for all of the bold maids that will go
that's
forward.
good, that's
Can we
good.
make that a thing?
We
bold
already
maids?
already
Done.
created a new language.
Please buy a book. I'm sure you already have if you're in here. Get your book signed. Enjoy your time, and tell everybody you know about this book.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out. Really, thank you so much.